Calvin Hartwell grabbed his sister's wrist so hard she dropped her coffee cup. It shattered on the kitchen floor, and he didn't even look down. "You're going," he said. "I already sent the letter. Man's expecting you by Friday." Evelyn stared at him. "You sold me." "I arranged a situation." He let go of her wrist and smoothed his jacket like he'd just signed a business contract. "Montana rancher. Needs a woman who can cook and clean. Doesn't care what she looks like." He paused, and the next words came out slow and deliberate, like he wanted each one to land. Which works out perfectly, since nobody around here ever did either. Well, if that opening made your blood boil, good. Stay with us. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now, because every week we bring you stories that will make you feel something real. Drop a like and tell us in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The morning Evelyn Hartwell turned 27, nobody remembered. Not her brother, not her sister-in-law Margaret, who had taken over the house after their mother died and never once let Evelyn forget that she was a guest in what used to be her own home. Not the ranch hands who passed through the property. Not the neighbors who had known her since she was a child with mud on her boots and a book tucked under her arm. The day came and went like any other. Evelyn woke before dawn, started the stove, made breakfast for 6 people, and ate her own portion standing at the counter because the table was always full by the time she finished serving everyone else. That was the shape of her life. Small, crowded out, pushed to the edges. She didn't cry about her birthday. She had stopped expecting things years ago, and somewhere in that process she had also stopped being surprised when nothing arrived. What she hadn't stopped doing, what she couldn't seem to kill no matter how many times she tried, was hoping. Not for much, just for something. A small acknowledgement that she existed, that she took up space in the world the same as anyone else. It never came. What came instead, 3 days after her birthday, was Calvin sitting at the head of the breakfast table with a letter in his hand and an expression on his face that she had learned over 15 years of living under his roof meant that something had already been decided without her. She was carrying a plate of eggs when he looked up. "Sit down, Evelyn." She set the plate in front of him and didn't sit. "I've got biscuits in the oven." "They can wait. Sit down." Margaret was already watching from the doorway with her arms crossed and that tight little smile she wore when she knew something Evelyn didn't. Their 2 children were eating without looking up. Nobody in this house ever looked up when something uncomfortable was happening. They had all gotten very good at finding something else to stare at. Evelyn pulled out the chair across from Calvin and sat. He set the letter on the table between them and smoothed it flat with the palm of his hand. "I've made arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" "Good ones?" He said it the way people say things they've rehearsed. "There's a man in Montana Territory, town called Amber Ridge, up in the mountains. Name's Gideon Vale. He owns a cattle ranch, a real one, not some homestead scrape. 300 head, maybe more. He wrote to a placement service looking for a wife." Evelyn looked at the letter. She didn't touch it. "A placement service." "Don't say it like that. It's common enough out west. Men who've got land and no time to go courting. Nothing shameful about it." "Did you respond to him on my behalf?" Calvin picked up his fork. "I responded on behalf of the family." "I'm not the family's property, Calvin." He chewed, swallowed, and looked at her with the particular patience of a man who has already stopped listening. "He's not expecting a beauty. He said so himself in his letter. Wants someone who can cook, run a household, handle herself on a working ranch. I told him you could do all of that." "What else did you tell him?" Something passed across Calvin's face. Not guilt. Calvin didn't do guilt. But something adjacent to it, some awareness that the next words required careful placement. "I told him you were practical, capable." "What else?" Margaret stepped into the kitchen then, precise as a stage entrance. "We told him the truth, Evelyn, that you're not a young girl anymore, that you're plain, and that you've never had a real suitor. Because those things are true, and a man deserves to know what he's agreeing to." The kitchen went very quiet. One of the children finally looked up, the younger one, a boy of about 9 named Thomas, who watched Evelyn with wide, uncertain eyes, like he knew something had just broken and wasn't sure if it was the kind of break that made noise. Evelyn looked at her hands on the table. They were rough hands, red at the knuckles, nails cut short because long nails got in the way of work. She had spent 15 years using those hands to keep this household running, and she was looking at them now like she was seeing them for the first time. "You told a stranger I was plain and unwanted," she said. "We told him you were available," Calvin said, and picked up his fork again. "Same thing," Margaret added. Evelyn stood up. She went to the oven and took out the biscuits. She set them on the cooling rack. She stared at the wall above the stove for a moment, at the old iron hook where her mother used to hang a wreath of dried lavender every spring, and she breathed. Then she turned around. "When does he expect me?" Calvin blinked. He had been braced for tears or argument, and the absence of either clearly unsettled him more than either would have. "Friday, train to Billings, then a hired coach north to Amber Ridge. I've already purchased the ticket." "With whose money?" "With money I set aside. Consider it a dowry, if that makes it easier." "It doesn't." She untied her apron. "I'll need a few days to pack." She left the kitchen. She walked down the hallway to the small room at the back of the house, the one with the window that faced the fence line and the oak tree that had been struck by lightning 6 years ago and never quite recovered. And she closed the door behind her. She didn't cry then either. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor and tried to understand what had just happened. Not the facts of it, those were plain enough, but the feeling underneath the facts, the specific texture of being handed off, of being a problem that had finally found its solution. After a long time, she pulled out the trunk from under the bed and started folding things into it. Her good wool dress? Her mother's recipe book, which was technically supposed to belong to the household, but which nobody else had ever opened. A small tin box with a broken clasp that held the only photograph she had of her mother, a folded handkerchief with embroidered edges, and a coin she'd found in a field when she was 12, and kept for no rational reason except that finding it had felt, in that moment, like a small private miracle. She didn't know what Gideon Vale looked like. She didn't know what his ranch looked like, or what Amber Ridge looked like, or what Montana Territory looked and smelled and sounded like, in the months when winter hadn't yet released its grip on the mountains. She only knew that on Friday she would get on a train, and by the time she got off it, she would be someone's mail-order wife, arranged and delivered like a piece of dry goods, and that the family she had spent 15 years serving would feel nothing but relief when she walked out the door. She folded her mother's shawl and set it on top. Then she sat back down on the bed and let herself, finally, be furious. Bet! The train ride took 4 days. Evelyn sat by the window and watched the country change. The familiar flat fields giving way to something wider and stranger, the sky getting bigger the further west they went, pressing down on the land like it had opinions. She ate the food she'd packed herself because she hadn't asked Calvin for spending money and wasn't going to. Hard biscuits and dried apple slices and a piece of salted pork wrapped in cloth. She drank from a canteen she'd filled at the station. The other passengers in her car were a young couple who argued quietly and constantly, a traveling salesman who slept with his mouth open, and an older woman in a dark dress who knitted without stopping and occasionally looked at Evelyn with the kind of assessment that people of a certain age feel entitled to deliver without speaking. On the second day, the older woman finally spoke. "Where are you headed?" "Montana Territory," Evelyn said. "Alone?" "Yes, ma'am." The woman's needles clicked. "Meeting someone?" Evelyn thought about how to answer that. In a manner of speaking. The woman looked at her for a long moment, then looked back at her knitting. "Well," she said, "the mountains either break you or they suit you. There's not much in between." Evelyn turned back to the window. "I've already been broken," she said quietly. "So I suppose we'll find out about the other part." The woman didn't answer, but she stopped knitting for a moment. Just a moment. Then the needles started again. Okay. The coach from Billings north to Amber Ridge took another day and a half, over roads that used the word loosely, through country that seemed to grow more indifferent to human presence the further north they went. Evelyn sat with her trunk wedged between her feet and the opposite seat and watched the mountains come up slow and enormous and absolutely unapologetic about their size. She had never seen mountains before. She had read about them. She had looked at engravings in books. None of it had prepared her for the way they sat on the horizon like something permanent. Not beautiful exactly, or not only beautiful, but authoritative. Like the kind of thing that was there before you and would be there after, and didn't need you to say anything about it. The other passenger in the coach was a man going to Amber Ridge on business, short and harried-looking with ink stains on his fingers and a document case he clutched like it might escape. He introduced himself as Mr. Fenn, said he was a surveyor, and then apparently ran out of conversation because he spent the rest of the journey staring at his hands. Evelyn was fine with that. She spent the time thinking about what she would say when she stepped out of the coach. What you said to a man who had agreed to marry a woman described to him as plain and unwanted and old enough that her prospects had run dry. Whether you thanked him or apologized or just looked at the ground and waited to see which direction things fell. She thought about her mother, who had been a quiet woman but not a weak one, who had shown Evelyn how to set a bone and brew a fever tea and calm a frightened horse by breathing slow near its neck, who had told her once, in the last winter before she died, that the thing people called plainness was usually just the look of a person who was too busy thinking to worry about being looked at. Evelyn had held on to that. Some days it was harder to hold than others. Amber Ridge was small. That wasn't a surprise. She hadn't expected a city, but small was maybe not even the right word. It was more like a place that had come together for practical reasons and hadn't bothered to discuss aesthetics. A main street with a general store, a livery, a small hotel, a post office, and what appeared to be a saloon that also served food. A church at the end of the block that looked newer than everything else. Side streets that became dirt paths very quickly. The coach stopped in front of the general store and the driver climbed down and started pulling luggage off the top. Evelyn stepped out and looked around. There were maybe a dozen people visible on the street, going about the business of a Wednesday morning. A woman carrying a basket. 2 men talking outside the livery. A boy chasing a dog that didn't want to be chased. And leaning against the post in front of the general store, with his arms crossed and his hat pushed back slightly on his head, a man who was watching the coach with an expression that suggested he had been there for a while and had not entirely decided what to feel about the fact that it had arrived. He was tall, taller than she'd expected, though she didn't know why she'd expected anything. Dark hair showing some gray at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been cut with a tool rather than grown. He wore working clothes. Not dressed up, not dressed down, just the clothes of a man who had come from somewhere that required actual physical labor and hadn't changed because he didn't think the occasion required it. His eyes found her immediately. Not in the way men's eyes usually found her. That flicker of assessment followed by the slight recalibration downward, the reorganizing of expectations. He just looked at her directly, the way you look at something you're trying to understand, and didn't look away. Evelyn stood on the step of the coach with her trunk in her hand and looked back. They regarded each other for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. Then he pushed off the post and walked toward her, and when he got close enough, she could see that the expression she'd read as undecided was actually something more like careful. Like a man who had taught himself to be careful because being otherwise had cost him something once. "You'd be Evelyn Hartwell," he said. Not a question exactly. More like he was saying it to make it real. "I would," she said. He put out his hand. "Gideon Vale." She shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and he let go before she did. "How was the trip?" "Long," she said, "and the last part of the road wants looking at." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. The thing that happens to a person's eyes right before the rest of their face catches up. "Fair assessment," he said. "I've been meaning to have it graded for 2 years. "Why haven't you?" "Because there's always something that needs doing more urgently." He picked up her trunk before she could argue about it, which she'd been prepared to do. "I've got the wagon out back. Store had a few things I needed to pick up before we headed out. Won't take long." She followed him around the side of the building. "Mr. Vale." "Gideon." "Gideon." She stopped walking. He stopped too and turned to look at her. "I think we should address certain things before we go any further." His expression was neutral but attentive. "All right. My brother described me to you in a particular way. I'd like to know if his description is what you're expecting, and if so, whether we're going to have a problem about the difference between a description and a person." Gideon set her trunk down. He looked at her for a moment with that same careful attention she'd noticed from across the street. "Your brother wrote that you were plain, practical, and past marrying age," he said. He wrote that you had no real prospects and that you were a burden on his household. He paused. He also wrote that you could cook, manage a home, and handle yourself around animals. That last part was the part I was interested in. And the first part? Didn't interest me much. He picked the trunk back up. But since we're being direct, I'm not looking for what your brother thinks I'm looking for. I've got a working ranch that's been running without a woman's hand for 4 years. I need a partner, not an ornament. If you can do the work and you're willing to be honest with me, we'll get along fine. Evelyn looked at him. That's all? That's enough to start with, he said. She followed him to the wagon. Gut. The ride out to the ranch took just over an hour, and they spent most of it in a silence that was not uncomfortable but also not yet comfortable. The silence of two people taking stock of each other without the cover of noise or distraction. At one point, she asked him how long he'd had the ranch. He said 12 years. She asked him how many men worked for him. He said 6 full-time, more in the summer. She asked him what the winters were like. He thought about it for a moment. Honest, he said. She glanced at him. What does that mean? It means the mountain doesn't pretend, he said. Down in the towns, people have got ways of softening things, making the hard parts look less hard. Out here, the winter just comes at you straight. You know exactly what you're dealing with. Some people would find that frightening. Some people do, he agreed. Others find it easier than the softening. Evelyn looked out at the mountains, close now and immense. I think I might be one of the second kind, she said, though I've never been tested. He didn't say anything to that, but she felt him glance at her. But the ranch house was not what she had expected. Not worse, just different. It was a solid structure, well built, made to last through weather that had opinions. But it had the unmistakable feeling of a place where function had long since crowded out everything else. The kitchen was serviceable but cheerless. The main room had furniture placed for utility, not comfort. Everything was clean enough, but nothing was warm. A man named Harley, older and weathered and looking at her with open curiosity, met them at the door and took the wagon horse. 2 other ranch hands watched from a distance, with expressions ranging from skeptical to simply tired. Gideon showed her through the house without apology or explanation, which she appreciated. He wasn't trying to sell her on the place. He showed her the kitchen, the root cellar, the pantry, with its current state of organization, which was minimal. He showed her the room she'd be sleeping in, separate from his, which he mentioned plainly and without awkwardness, and said it needed airing out, which was an understatement, but the bones of it were fine. When the tour was done, they stood in the kitchen, and there was a moment where the whole strange architecture of the situation settled around them both. I expect you're tired, he said. I'm all right. He nodded. He started toward the door, then stopped, turned back. Evelyn? She looked at him. What your brother wrote about you, the way he described you. He seemed to weigh his next words the way you weigh something you're not sure will hold. A man who writes about his own sister that way. I don't think I'd trust his judgment on much else. She stood very still. I'm not saying that to make you feel better, he added. I'm saying it because it's what I think, and I don't see any use in not saying it. He went out. Evelyn stood in the middle of the kitchen with the late afternoon light coming through the single window, and something happened in her chest that she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was more like the specific sensation of a door that had been held shut for a very long time, releasing its latch. Just a little. Just enough to feel the air move through. She looked around the cold, cheerless kitchen, at the shelves that needed organizing, the floor that needed sweeping, the window that needed a curtain, the stove that needed a good cleaning before it would cook properly. She pushed up her sleeves. There was work to do. The kitchen was a disaster, and Evelyn was glad of it. Not the kind of glad that comes from other people's misfortune. The kind that comes from having something real and specific to do with your hands when your mind is too full of everything else. The stove had a grease buildup along the back wall that suggested it hadn't been properly cleaned in at least 2 seasons. The shelves were organized by no principle she could identify. Tins of coffee, next to axle grease, next to a jar of what appeared to be last year's preserves, with the seal gone bad. The floor had been swept recently enough, but swept wasn't the same as clean, and the difference mattered in a kitchen where food was being prepared. She started with the stove. By the time the light outside the window shifted from afternoon to early evening, she had the stove cleaned, the shelves reorganized, the bad preserves disposed of, and a pot of beans on with salt pork and dried onion because it was what the pantry had, and beans fed people reliably, which was what mattered right now. She had also found, in the back of a lower cabinet, a cast iron skillet seasoned so beautifully it was almost worth crying over, the kind of pan that takes years of careful use to develop and which some previous hand had tended with real attention. She wondered who that had been. Not Gideon. She didn't know yet whether he cooked, but the rest of the kitchen's chaos suggested he hadn't been the one maintaining that skillet. Someone before her. Someone who had cared about this kitchen, once. She was turning that thought over when the back door opened and Harley came in, stopped dead when he smelled the beans, and looked at her with an expression that shifted from surprise to something more complicated. "You cook?" he said. "Most people do," Evelyn said. "Most people who come through here don't cook like that smells." He pulled off his hat. He was older than she'd initially clocked, closer to 60, with a face that had weathered into something almost geological. "I'm Harley Briggs. I run the hands. Been with Gideon going on 9 years. Evelyn Hartwell." "I know who you are." He said it without hostility, just fact. He moved to the table and sat down with the ease of a man who had been sitting at that table for 9 years and didn't feel the need to ask permission. "We weren't sure what to expect." "Neither was I," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You settled in all right? Your room?" "It needs airing out. I'll open the window tonight." "It gets cold." "I'll put on an extra blanket." He almost smiled. "Where are you from?" "Ohio, outside of Columbus." "Long way." He turned his hat over in his hands. "You ever been on a working ranch before?" "No, but I've kept a farmhouse, managed a household of 8, and I know enough about animals to not make them nervous." She stirred the beans. "I expect the rest is learnable." Harley considered this. "Gideon's a fair man," he said, which was not a direct response but felt like one, like he was giving her information he thought she'd need. "Hard to get to know, but fair. I noticed. The other men—" He paused, turned his hat over again. "They're not unkind, but they don't know what to make of you yet. Give them a few days." "I'll give them whatever they need," Evelyn said. "I'm not in a hurry." He nodded. He put his hat back on. He stood up and then hesitated, which for a man like Harley was obviously not a common occurrence. "That skillet you've got there," he said. "You know how to use it?" "I do." "Good." He moved toward the door. It was Gideon's wife's, Clara. She passed 4 years back. He stopped with his hand on the doorframe. "He doesn't talk about her. I'm not saying don't ask. I'm saying when you ask, pick your moment." He went out before she could answer. Evelyn stood at the stove and held that information and felt the weight of it settle onto everything else she was already carrying. Undone that. Dinner was not a comfortable affair, but it was an honest one. There were 6 men at the table, Gideon at the head, Harley to his left, and 4 ranch hands ranging in age from maybe 20 to somewhere around 40. Their names came at her in a cluster. Pete, who was young and freckled and kept his eyes on his bowl. Doyle, broad-shouldered and quiet in a way that might have been shy or might have been unfriendly. 2 brothers named Sam and Walt Greer, who looked enough alike to be confusing and apparently found this amusing based on the matching expressions they wore when she mixed their names up. The 6th man came in late. She heard him before she saw him. Boots on the porch with more weight behind them than necessary, the door opening without a knock. He was tall the way a problem is tall, filling space aggressively, and he had a face that would have been handsome if it weren't so arranged around a permanent expression of minor contempt. He looked at the pot of beans on the table. Then he looked at Evelyn. Then he looked at Gideon. "Didn't know we were having company," he said. "Russ." Gideon's voice was even. "Sit down." "Just saying." Russ pulled out a chair. "Expected things would stay the same a while longer." "Things change," Gideon said. "Sit down." Russ sat, but he did it slowly and with the particular energy of a man who wants you to notice that he's choosing to comply. He took the ladle and served himself without passing it, which Evelyn noted but didn't react to. She was at the counter, cutting the cornbread she'd mixed up in the last half hour, and she kept her attention on that. "Smells all right," Pete offered into the silence. "It's beans," Doyle said. "Good beans," Pete said, and ate a spoonful to demonstrate. Russ ate without commenting on the food, which under the circumstances was almost a kind of commentary in itself. He glanced at Evelyn twice during the meal, both times with the specific look of a man assessing a situation he feels he should have been consulted about. After dinner, when most of the men had drifted out, Evelyn was washing the bowls and she heard Russ's voice from the doorway behind her. "How long are you planning to stay?" She didn't turn around. "I'm not sure that's your question to ask. Gideon's a busy man. He doesn't need complications." "Then it's lucky I'm here to reduce them." She put a bowl on the drying rack. "I managed a household of 8 for 15 years. I can manage a ranch kitchen and 6 ranch hands without creating complications. But thank you for your concern." Silence. Then, "I knew his wife." That made her stop. She set down the bowl and turned around. Russ was in the doorway with his arms crossed, and the contempt in his face was still there, but something else had gotten mixed in with it, something rougher and more honest. "She was a good woman," he said. "I expect she was," Evelyn said. "Nobody's replacing her. I'm not trying to." He looked at her for another moment, and whatever calculus he was running didn't appear to reach a conclusion. He turned and went out. Evelyn turned back to her washing. Her hands were steadier than she felt. The first week was a matter of finding out where the edges were. The land itself she discovered slowly, in pieces. Walking out in the early morning before anyone else was up, going a little further each time, learning the lay of things. The barn and the outbuildings, the fence lines going east and west, the creek that ran along the north pasture, cold enough in May to make your teeth hurt, clear enough to show you the bottom. The way the mountains sat around the ranch like they were holding it in a cupped hand, and the way the light came down through them at different angles, at different times of day, so that the same view looked like a different place depending on when you stood there. She learned the kitchen's rhythms. Breakfast at 5:30 for the men heading out. Earlier in summer, she'd been told. Later in deep winter when the days gave you nothing to work with anyway. Dinner at midday when the work allowed. Supper in the evening. She cooked what the pantry had, which was adequate but unimaginative, and she started a mental list of what she'd need from the general store in Amber Ridge to do better. She learned the men, too, in the way you learn people when you're living alongside them without the formality of social occasion to smooth things over. Pete was homesick. She could see it in the way he ate, like food was the closest thing to comfort he had out here, and she made sure his bowl was always full. Doyle, who had seemed unfriendly, turned out to be simply a person who didn't talk much but worked harder than anyone on the property and had a habit of quietly fixing things that other people hadn't noticed were broken. The Greer brothers were loud in the evenings and efficient in the mornings and had been working ranches since they were children, which meant they knew more about cattle than she'd ever learn, but also meant they sometimes forgot there were other kinds of knowledge that mattered. Russ kept his distance. He wasn't openly hostile after that first evening, but he watched her in the way you watch something you haven't made up your mind about yet. She let him watch. She had nothing to hide and nothing to prove, and she'd spent enough of her life managing people who needed careful handling to know that forcing the issue never worked. You showed people who you were by being it, consistently, over time, and either they came around or they didn't. Gideon was the most difficult to read, not because he was cold. He wasn't cold exactly. But he was contained in a way that went deeper than personality. It was the containment of a man who had learned, through something specific and painful, that the things you let yourself want have a way of costing you. He was courteous to her. He answered her questions directly, usually with the minimum number of words that would adequately address the subject. He ate what she cooked without complaint, and with occasional brief appreciation. He stayed out of her kitchen when she was working in it, which she appreciated, and when he needed to come through, he said so and waited. But he didn't ask her things, didn't ask where she'd come from, what she'd done before, what she thought about the place, whether she was settling in or struggling. Most people meeting a stranger under unusual circumstances fill silence with questions. Gideon did not. She asked Harley about it one morning when they were both up before the others. "Is he always this quiet?" Or is this about me specifically? Harley poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. Some of both, I'd say. That's not very helpful. No. He drank. He was different before. Not louder exactly, but more present, more… I don't know the word. Open? Maybe. Claire used to pull conversation out of him. She had a way. He said it without sentiment, just fact. After she went, he sort of pulled in. Does the work. Keeps things running. But he stopped. He considered. He stopped reaching for things, I think. Stopped wanting things that weren't practical. Evelyn looked into her coffee. Didn't mean to make that heavy, Harley said. It's not heavy, she said. It's just… I understand it. He looked at her. You lost someone? Not the same way. She thought about her mother, about 15 years of being looked at and not seen, about the specific grief of wanting to be known and consistently failing to achieve it. But I understand pulling in, making yourself smaller so there's less to hurt. Harley was quiet for a moment. You don't seem very small to me, he said finally. She looked at him. He wasn't saying it to flatter her, she could tell. He was saying it because it was what he observed, the same way he'd say the fence on the north pasture needed mending or the gelding in stall 3 was favoring his left front leg. Just what was there. Thank you, she said. He nodded and went out, and she stood in the kitchen by herself with the thin morning light coming through the new curtain she'd put up 2 days ago, and she thought that this place, rough and cold and full of men who didn't know what to make of her, might be the first place in a very long time where she was being looked at straight. Oh, on the 9th day, she made pie. Not because there was a particular occasion, and not to impress anyone. She had 2 pounds of dried cherries in the pantry that needed using before they went past keeping, and she had learned from her mother that the most reliable use for overripe dried fruit was a pie with a double crust and enough sugar to balance the tartness. She made 2 of them because the math of dried cherries and the size of the pans she'd found required it. The men came in for supper and stopped when they saw the pies cooling on the counter. Pete said, "Are those for us?" "They're not for the horses," she said. Something happened to the table after that. She couldn't have described it precisely, but the energy shifted. A loosening, something that had been held in careful check releasing just slightly. Sam Greer elbowed his brother and said something she didn't catch that made Walt grin. Even Doyle looked at the pies with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose internal accounting had just moved a column. Russ didn't say anything, but she watched him take a second slice when he thought no one was looking, and she turned away before he could catch her noticing. Gideon said, at the end of the meal, "That was a good pie." "They usually are," she said, not boasting, just what was true. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw that precursor to a smile thing happen not just in his eyes, but in the corners of his mouth, brief and slightly surprised, like an expression that had gotten out before he decided to let it. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He thought about it seriously. "Someone more apologetic." She considered that. "I used to be," she said. "I got tired of it." He nodded slowly, and she couldn't tell if he was agreeing with the philosophy or just acknowledging that she'd said it. He stood and brought his dish to the counter, something she had noticed he always did, never left it for her to collect, and went out toward the barn. She watched him go and felt the shape of him settling into her understanding of this place, this particular life that she had been, for better or worse, delivered into. The letter arrived on the 14th day. She knew it was from Calvin by the handwriting on the outside, blocky and upright and lacking any particular warmth. She stood at the gate of the post office in Amber Ridge. She'd come with Harley for the weekly supply run, and held it for a moment before opening it. It was short. That was characteristic of Calvin, who had never seen the value in more words than the minimum required. "I trust you've arrived safely. Margaret asks that you write when you're able. We hope the arrangement is working out. The harvest is looking decent this year. Thomas has been asking about you." She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket. "Bad news?" Harley asked, coming up alongside her with a crate of flour. "No," she said. "Just… news." She took the other end of the crate without being asked. My brother. Making sure I arrived. Making sure you stayed, more like, Harley said, without particular judgment. She glanced at him. He shrugged. Man sends his sister away to a stranger in Montana. He's not writing out of affection, he said. He's writing to confirm the transaction completed. The bluntness of it hit her differently than she expected. Not like a wound, more like something she'd already known being said plainly for the first time. She was quiet for a moment, and Harley let her be quiet, which was one of the things she was learning to value about him. Thomas is my nephew, she said finally. He's 9. He used to bring me things he found, rocks, birds' feathers. Once he brought me a dead beetle like it was a treasure. She paused. He's the only one in that house I'll actually miss. Harley loaded the flour into the wagon. You could write to him. Kids remember letters. I know. She climbed up to the seat. I will. They drove back to the ranch in the comfortable silence that comes from having said what needed saying and having nowhere else it needed to go. And Evelyn sat with the letter in her pocket and the mountains all around her and tried to figure out if what she was feeling was grief or relief or some third thing that didn't have a name yet, because it had never come up before. She was in the barn on the 16th day when Gideon found her. She'd been checking on the horse Harley had mentioned, the gelding with the sore leg, because nobody had seemed to get around to it, and she'd been watching him favor it for 3 days, and it was bothering her. She had him in crosties and was crouched by his left foreleg, running her fingers up from the fetlock, and the horse was unhappy about it, but tolerating her because she'd spent 20 minutes first just standing near him and talking quietly about nothing. What are you doing? She looked up. Gideon was in the barn doorway with his arms at his sides and an expression that was surprised but not, she noticed, alarmed at the sight of her with his horse. His leg's been bothering him 3 days, she said. I wanted to see if it's heat and swelling or if he picked something up. She went back to the leg. It's heat. Right at the fetlock, soft swelling. He'll need the hoof picked and probably a poultice and a few days out of rotation. Silence. Then Gideon walked into the barn and crouched beside her, close enough to see what she was seeing. He ran his own hand along the same line and felt the heat she'd found, and she watched his jaw tighten slightly. Not at her, she thought, but at himself, for not having caught it. How do you know this? He asked. My mother. She grew up on a horse farm. She taught me what to look for. She sat back on her heels. You've got a good horse here. Sensible. He just needs a couple of days. Gideon didn't stand up right away. He stayed crouched next to the gelding, his hand still on the horse's leg, and Evelyn was close enough to see the lines around his eyes, and the way his shoulders carried weight even when he wasn't lifting anything. His name's Copper, Gideon said. Had him 7 years. He trusts you, she said. I could tell by the way he settled when you came in. Gideon looked at her, and this time there was no precursor. The something in his expression arrived fully formed and undisguised. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. The look of a person encountering something they didn't expect and finding they are not displeased. I'll get the poultice materials, he said. I'll do it, she said. I know what's needed. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he stood and stepped back, not out of the barn but back against the wall, giving her room, watching her work. She didn't mind being watched. Not like this. This was different from the watching she'd grown up under, the assessing, diminishing, categorizing kind. This was the watching of a person trying to understand something they found genuinely interesting. She worked, and he watched, and the horse stood quietly under her hands, and outside the mountains held the afternoon light until it finally went. Copper's leg healed in 4 days, which was 1 day faster than Evelyn had estimated, and she chose to take this as a sign that the mountain had decided to cooperate, at least in small matters. She kept him out of rotation for a 5th day anyway because the heat had come back slightly on the 3rd morning, and she didn't trust a recovery that moved too fast. Gideon didn't question her on it. He just told Harley to leave Copper in the paddock another day, and Harley nodded like this was an entirely normal development, like the woman who'd arrived 3 weeks ago with a rope-tied suitcase had always been the one making decisions about the horses. That was the thing about this place she hadn't expected. Not the cold, not the work, not the scale of the land. What she hadn't expected was how quickly her presence started to matter in ways that had nothing to do with being tolerated. Pete started saving her the best pieces of firewood without being asked, the dry ones that caught fast and burned clean. Walt Greer taught her the names of the different pastures, Northcut, Flint Flat, the section they called the Bowl because of how the hills curved around it, so she'd understand what the men were talking about at supper. Even Doyle, who had still never initiated a conversation with her, had started leaving small things on the kitchen windowsill. Once a handful of early wildflowers he'd pulled up somewhere in the high pasture. Once a stone with an interesting color that she suspected he'd carried in his pocket for some time before deciding she should have it. She put the stone on the shelf above the stove. Nobody mentioned it, but she noticed Doyle look at it once and then look away with an expression that suggested he was satisfied. Russ remained the exception. He didn't antagonize her openly. She'd give him that. Whatever private war he was fighting about her presence, he kept it mostly internal. But there was a resistance in him that didn't soften the way the others had, and she could feel it at the table each evening, a low-grade friction like a window that doesn't quite sit right in its frame. She was thinking about this on a Tuesday morning in early June, when the weather changed without warning the way it apparently did here, which was to say without any courtesy whatsoever. She'd been hanging laundry on the line behind the house, an optimistic decision she regretted approximately 40 minutes later when the sky to the northwest turned the particular shade of greenish-gray that she'd been told by Walt Greer meant trouble. She got half the laundry down before the wind arrived, and the other half became somebody else's problem. And then she was running for the back door with an armful of shirts and the sound of the barn's main door slamming open and shut somewhere behind her. The storm hit hard and fast, which she was learning was the mountain's preferred method of making a point. Rain first, then something between rain and hail, then hail in earnest, loud and aggressive against the roof, and the temperature dropping fast enough that she could feel it through the walls. The men who'd been out came in over the next half hour in clusters, wet and irritable, tracking mud across her clean floor without apology, which she'd also learned to expect. She put on the big coffee pot and started making something hot, because that was the useful thing to do, and she was always looking for the useful thing. Gideon was the last one in. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen with water running off the brim of his hat and a look on his face that she'd come to recognize as the one he wore when he was calculating damage. Not panicking, just adding up numbers. "How bad?" Harley asked. "2 sections of north fence, maybe 3. He pulled off his hat, ran his hand through his wet hair. "Flint Flat gates down. We'll need to check on the cattle in the bowl first thing when this breaks." "The horses are all in?" Evelyn asked. "All but Copper." He looked at her. "He was in the east paddock. Harley, did someone— I thought Pete got him." "Moosh." Pete looked up from his coffee. "I thought Walt— Nobody got him," Walt said. The kitchen went quiet except for the hail. Evelyn was already moving toward the door. "Evelyn?" Gideon's voice was not a command, but it was close. "He'll have gone for the barn," she said, pulling on her coat. "The paddock gate faces east. If it blew, he went east. There's a ravine." "I know where the ravine is. You're not going out in this." She looked at him. He was blocking the door, not deliberately, but effectively, standing between her and the outside with a foot of height on her, and the expression of a man who felt he was being reasonable. "Gideon," she said, very levelly, "I can find him faster than any of your men right now because I know how he moves when he's scared. I've been working with him every day for 2 weeks. Move, please." Something in his face shifted. She'd said please, which she thought was probably what did it, not backing down but also not making it a fight. He moved. She went out into the hail. It was loud in a way she hadn't anticipated, the sound of it hitting the ground and the outbuildings creating a kind of white noise that made it hard to think. She kept her head down and moved east, past the paddock where the gate was indeed hanging open and banging in the wind, following the fence line where it went toward the lower pasture. She found Copper 20 yards from the ravine. He was standing with his back to the wind, legs braced, head down, and when she got close enough for him to hear her over the storm, he turned his head and his ears went straight up, and he made a sound that was not quite a whinny, more like a large, frightened creature recognizing something familiar. "I know," she said. "I know, come on." She got her hand on his halter, and he came with her immediately, which was both a relief and a thing she filed away. That he trusted her enough to move through bad weather on her word. That wasn't nothing. That took time to build, and she hadn't fully known they'd gotten there until this moment. Getting back to the barn was harder than finding him. The hail had gotten worse and the footing was bad, and Copper was not a small horse, and he was nervous enough that every unexpected sound made him shift his weight suddenly. She talked to him the whole way. Not soothing nonsense, real talk. About where they were going, what the ground was like, how far the barn was. Her mother had told her that horses could tell the difference between a person who believed what they were saying and a person who was just making sounds, and she'd always believed it. When she got the barn door open and got him inside and got the door shut again, she stood for a moment with her hand on his neck and her head leaned against him and breathed. The barn was considerably quieter than the outside world. "Good boy," she said. "Good boy." The door behind her opened. Gideon came in. He was soaked, which meant he'd come out after her, which she hadn't expected. He looked at her, then at Copper, then back at her. He had an expression she couldn't quite name, something between relief and something rawer than relief. "He came without a fight?" he asked. "He was ready to come in," she said. "He just needed someone to show him it was safe." Gideon walked to Copper and ran his hand along the horse's neck, checking him over in the practiced way of a man who has cared for animals long enough that the check is half automatic. Copper stood quietly. "You should have waited," Gideon said. He didn't say it with anger. He said it with the particular flatness of a person who is not saying the more complicated thing underneath it. "He'd have gone in the ravine." "Maybe." Not maybe. She was wringing water out of her sleeve, not looking at him. "He'd have gone in the ravine, and you know it, and if I'd waited for someone else to go out, he might have gone in before anyone found him." Silence. "You're right," Gideon said. She looked up. He was watching her with that direct, careful attention, the look that she'd seen from the first day and had slowly been learning the language of. He wasn't a demonstrative man. He didn't say more than he meant, which meant when he said "you're right" with that particular quality in his voice, he meant more than those two words, and she was starting to understand what the extra part was. "I'm going to check the fence," he said, "when the storm breaks." "I'll have something hot when you get back." He nodded. He went to the barn door, paused with his hand on it. "Evelyn." She waited. "What you just did." He stopped, seemed to decide something. "Thank you." He went out into the storm. She stood in the barn with a wet horse and a feeling in her chest that was considerably warmer than the weather had any right to produce, and she stayed there a little longer than she needed to. Russ found her in the barn the next morning. She was brushing Copper down, finishing the job she'd started the night before when everyone was too exhausted to do it properly. The storm had broken around midnight and left behind a silence so complete it had woken her up, which she hadn't expected but probably should have. Russ stood at the barn entrance with his thumbs in his belt and looked at her working and didn't say anything for long enough that she finally said it for him. "Whatever it is, just say it." He was quiet for another few seconds. Then, "You could have gotten yourself killed last night." "But I didn't." "That's not the point." "What's the point, Russ?" He walked in slowly, like he was measuring each step. "The point is this isn't Ohio. This isn't whatever safe little situation you came from. This mountain will kill you just as easy as it'll kill a calf that wanders too far from its mother, and it won't feel anything about it either way." "I know that," she said. She didn't stop brushing. "I'm not stupid, and I'm not reckless. I went out because I knew what I was doing, and I came back, and Copper came back, and the only outcome that mattered was the one we got. And if it went the other way?" She stopped and looked at him. "Then I'd have been wrong, and I'd have paid for being wrong. That's how it works." She went back to brushing. "But I don't make decisions based on worst outcomes. I make them based on best information." Russ leaned against the stall gate. He crossed his arms. He looked at her with an expression that had shifted somewhere she hadn't seen it go before. Less contempt, more something reluctant and almost against his will. "You're going to stay," he said. It wasn't a question. "Was that ever seriously in doubt?" A long pause. "When Gideon wrote to that placement service, I tried to talk him out of it. Told him it was too soon, that he wasn't ready." He looked at Copper. "I still think it was too soon." "Maybe," Evelyn said. "But here we are." "Here we are," he agreed. She finished with Copper's left side and moved to the right. For what it's worth, she said, I'm not trying to be Clara. I didn't know her. I can't be her, and I'm not trying. Russ's jaw tightened. How do you know about Clara? Harley told me. About the skillet. She glanced at him. And because it's obvious, Russ, a man doesn't close up that completely without a reason, and the reason is usually grief. He didn't answer. I'm not here to replace anything, she said. I'm just here. He was quiet for a long time. Then he uncrossed his arms and pushed off the gate. Storm took down more fence in the north section than Gideon counted last night, he said. Going to need most of us on it today. I'll have breakfast ready by 5. He started for the door. Stopped. The dried cherry pie, he said, without turning around. It was good. She kept brushing. I know, she said. He made a sound that might, under generous interpretation, have been a short laugh. Then he went out. The fence repair took 3 days. She knew it because every evening the men came in with a particular kind of tired that was different from the regular kind, deeper in the bones, less interested in talking. She fed them well and left them alone, which was its own form of respect, and she used the daylight hours when the house was empty to do the things she'd been meaning to do since she arrived. She scrubbed the main room floor and put down the braided rug she'd found rolled up in a storage closet, clearly unused for years. She mended the curtains in the 2 front windows that had been hanging crooked since she'd arrived. She reorganized the root cellar into something logical, which took most of an afternoon and resulted in the discovery of 3 jars of apple butter from what appeared to be at least 4 years ago and a crate of potatoes that had seen better days. She also, on the second afternoon, sat down at the small writing desk in the corner of the main room and wrote a letter to Thomas. She'd been putting it off without fully understanding why. Now, sitting down to it, she thought she understood. She hadn't known what to say about this place until she'd been in it long enough to have something true to report. You couldn't write an honest letter about a life you hadn't lived yet. She wrote about Copper. She wrote about the mountains and how they looked in the morning when the light was still low, and everything had that particular blue-gray color that she didn't have a name for. She wrote about Harley and his 9 years on the ranch and the way he poured coffee with the seriousness of a man performing a small ceremony. She wrote about the pie because Thomas had always loved when she made pie, and she wanted him to know that she was still doing the things that were hers. She did not write about Calvin or about the letter she'd gotten. She did not write about the night in Billings in the 3rd-floor hotel room where she'd sat on the edge of a narrow bed and tried to make peace with a decision that wasn't really hers. She wrote things that were true without being all of the truth, because Thomas was 9, and 9 was old enough to know people could be unhappy, but young enough that you still tried to protect him from the specifics. She ended the letter. I think you would like it here. There is a horse named Copper who I think would like you too. When you are old enough to make your own decisions about where to go, I hope you will come and see. She sealed it and put it on the table to send with Harley on the next supply run. On the evening the fence was finished, Gideon came in for supper and paused at the entrance to the main room. She watched him notice the rug. He stood there for a moment with his hat in his hands, looking at it, and she couldn't tell what he was thinking. It was an old rug. She hadn't put down something new, just rescued something that had been put away, and she'd thought it would make the room warmer without making it different in any way that would be hard. Where did you find that? He asked. Storage closet, off the back hall. She put supper on the table, something that had been put away, and she'd thought it would make the room warmer without making it different in any way that would be hard. Where did you find that? He asked. Storage closet, off the back hall. She put supper on the table. If you'd rather it stayed in the closet, I can put it back. He looked at it for another moment. Clara put it away, he said, after she'd been meaning to mend a section and she didn't get to it. Evelyn looked at the rug. She hadn't noticed a mended section. She'd done it herself the second day she found it, with wool she'd unraveled from a sock that was too far gone to save, the closest match she could find in the mending basket. I mended it, she said. There was a section coming apart on the east edge. I matched the color as close as I could. He looked at her. Then he looked back at the rug. He went and crouched down at the east edge and found the section, running his finger along the repair. The match wasn't perfect. It was slightly darker than the original, but it held, and the pattern read through if you didn't look too close. He stayed crouched there longer than looking at a rug required. When he stood up, his face was arranged carefully, the way he arranged it when something had gotten through his defenses and he was deciding what to do about it. "Thank you," he said. For the second time, and this time it carried more weight than it had in the barn. "It's a good rug," she said. "Waste to leave it rolled up." He sat down at the table. She served supper. The men came in from washing up and filled their chairs, and for a little while the main room was full of the noise and heat of people who'd worked hard and earned their food, and Evelyn moved between kitchen and table and felt, in a way she was careful not to trust too completely just yet, that she was somewhere she was supposed to be. It was after supper, when the others had gone out and she was clearing the table, that she became aware Gideon had not moved. He sat at the end of the table with his coffee cup and watched her work, and it was the same quality of watching she'd felt in the barn. Not passive, not vacant, but active in the way attention is active when it's finally landed somewhere after a long time moving. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She stacked plates. "You can ask." "Why did you agree to come?" She almost smiled, not quite. "You mean, other than the fact that my brother had already sent the letter and purchased the train ticket?" "Yes, other than that." She set the plates down and thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about anything. "Because there was nothing keeping me there," she said, "and because the alternative, staying in that house, being managed, being the family's situation for another 15 years, I couldn't see it." She picked the plates back up. "And because I didn't think a man who was willing to be plain about what he needed was a man who was going to waste my time. And if it had been bad, I'd have figured something else out." She carried the plates to the kitchen. "I'm not helpless, Gideon. I was made to feel like I was for a long time, but that's different from being it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I didn't ask you here because I thought you were helpless." "I know. I want to be clear about that." She came back to the table and looked at him. In the lamplight, he looked older than he did in daylight. Not in a diminished way, but in the way that faces sometimes tell more of the truth when they're not trying to manage an impression. "Harley told me about Clara," she said. "Not details, just enough." He looked at his coffee. "I'm not going to pretend that's not part of what I'm navigating," she said. "It would be foolish, and I don't think you want foolish." "No." "So I'm just going to say, I know this is complicated for you. I know I'm in a house where someone else was, and I know that's not simple, and I'm not asking you to pretend it is." She began to move away, then stopped. "But I'm also not going anywhere. I'm here, and I intend to do good work here, and I'd like to stop being waited out and start being present, if that's something you can manage." The silence after that was different from the other silences. It had more in it. "I think I can manage it," Gideon said finally, quietly, like an admission that cost something but that he'd decided was worth the cost. She nodded. She took the rest of the dishes to the kitchen. Outside, the mountains sat in the dark the way they always did, holding the valley in their cupped hands, indifferent and enormous and entirely unimpressed with the small, difficult progress being made inside this particular house on this particular night. But the lamp was on, and the rug was down, and something that had been closed for 4 years was beginning, very slowly, in the careful way of things that have learned to be careful, to open. Victor Crowell came to Amber Ridge on a Thursday in late June, and the town noticed him the way it noticed anything that didn't belong, quietly, carefully, and without letting on that it was paying attention. Evelyn heard about him first from Walt Greer, who'd been in town for supplies and came back with flour, coffee, and information in roughly equal measure. Walt had the particular gift of a man who appeared entirely unremarkable in public spaces, which meant people talked around him without accounting for him, which meant he consistently returned from town knowing things. "Land agent," Walt said at supper. "Name's Crowell, Victor Crowell. Set himself up in the hotel, brought 2 men with him. Dressed better than anyone's got a reason to dress in Amber Ridge." "What kind of land agent?" Gideon asked. "The kind with a briefcase and a smile that works too hard." Walt pulled a roll apart. Talked to Alderman Finch at the post office. Said he represents a development interest out of Helena, looking at the valley. What part of the valley? That's what nobody could get a straight answer on. Russ set down his coffee. Development interest. That's a nice way of saying somebody wants something. Somebody always wants something, Harley said. Out here they want land or water, Russ said, and we've got both. The table was quiet for a moment, with the particular quality of quiet that comes from a group of people who work land understanding a threat to it. Gideon said nothing. He finished his meal, pushed back his chair, and said he was going to check the cattle in the bowl before dark. He went out, and Evelyn watched him go and recognized the set of his shoulders. Not tense exactly, but arranged in a way that meant he was thinking hard about something he didn't yet have enough information to address. She filed the name away. Victor Crowell. Attempt. She met him herself 12 days later. She'd gone into Amber Ridge with Harley for the weekly supply run and the monthly stop at the bank, where she'd opened a modest account with a portion of the household money Gideon had given her to manage. Something that had surprised her when he offered it. The easy way he said, "You're running the house. You should be handling what the house needs," like it was the obvious conclusion rather than a choice he'd made. She was coming out of the general store with a crate of goods when a man stepped out of the hotel doorway and nearly walked into her. He caught himself. He also caught the crate, one hand shooting out to stabilize it, and the gesture was so practiced it felt choreographed. "My apologies entirely," he said. "I wasn't watching where I was going." He was perhaps 50, or carrying 50 well. Good suit, like Walt had said, too good for the dirt street he was standing on. Hair oiled back from a face that was handsome in a way that had clearly been worked at. His smile arrived quickly and stayed in place with the discipline of a tool being kept ready. "No harm done," Evelyn said, and moved to go around him. "Are you from the area?" he asked. She stopped. Not because she owed him an answer, but because something in the question's timing was just slightly off, like it had been prepared. "I live nearby," she said. "Victor Crowell." He put out his hand. "I'm here on behalf of a development interest, looking at opportunities in the valley." She shook his hand because refusing would have required an explanation she didn't want to give yet. "Evelyn Vale," she said, which was the first time she'd used that name. It came out more naturally than she'd expected. Something moved behind his eyes. Recognition or the filing of information? "Vale? Would that be Gideon Vale's ranch? Up in the north section?" "It would." "Fine property," Crowell said, with the particular appreciation of a man who has assessed something's value before admiring it. "Beautiful section of the valley. Your husband is a fortunate man to hold that land." "I'll tell him you said so," she said. She took her crate and went to find Harley. In the wagon on the way back, she told Harley about the encounter, word for word, the way her mother had taught her to report things. Not interpretation first, facts first, then interpretation. Harley listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "He knew who you were before you told him." "That's what I thought, too." "Man like that doesn't nearly walk into people by accident." "No," she said. Harley flicked the reins. "I'll tell Gideon tonight." "I'll tell him," she said. "I was the one there." Gideon's reaction was not what she expected, which was to say it was not a reaction in the visible sense. He heard her out the same way Harley had, quietly, completely, without interruption. Then he sat with it for a moment. "He said development interest," Gideon said. That's the word he used. He said Helena. "There's no development interest out of Helena that I've heard of that's got business in this valley." He stood up from the table. "But that doesn't mean there isn't one. What would they want?" He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding how much to say, not because he didn't trust her, she didn't think, but because he was a man who didn't like to speak about things he wasn't sure of yet. "Water rights," he said finally. "This ranch sits on the primary water source for the north section of the valley. 2 ranches to the south depend on the creek that runs through my land. If someone wanted to control how water moves through this valley, they'd need to start here. And if they controlled the water, they'd control the valley." He picked up his hat from the table. "I need to talk to Alderman Finch, and to McCready. He runs the Double C south of us. He should know someone's looking around. Gideon? She waited until he looked at her. He was smooth, practiced. Whatever he's doing, he's done it before. He nodded slowly. I know the type. Do you know how to beat the type? The question seemed to land differently than she'd meant it. Not challenging, just direct, and she could see him recalibrate. I'm working on it, he said. Then after a pause, you did right, telling me straight. She watched him go out and sat for a minute at the table, turning her coffee cup in her hands, thinking about the way Victor Crowell's smile had stayed exactly in place the whole time they spoke, not shifting even slightly, which she knew from experience was not how real smiles worked. 2 weeks passed, and then 3, and Crowell stayed in Amber Ridge and the valley began to talk. The stories came to Evelyn through the usual channels. Walt from town, Harley from the other ranchers he crossed paths with, occasionally Russ, who had apparently decided at some point that withholding information from her was less useful than sharing it. A rancher named Dill Hasper, who ran a small operation east of Amber Ridge, had sold 200 acres of his lower pasture to Crowell's development interest for what people described variously as a fair price or a suspiciously good one depending on who you talked to. Another rancher, older man, a widower named August Pearl, who'd been running cattle in the valley for 30 years, had taken a loan from an eastern bank that Crowell appeared to have facilitated, the terms of which Pearl didn't fully understand and which Crowell had helpfully explained in a way that apparently left Pearl more confused than before but unwilling to say so. Gideon tracked all of this and said little. He rode out to meet McCready and 2 other ranchers she hadn't met, a husband and wife team named Birch, who ran the operation closest to the mountains, and a man named Tolliver, who was apparently in his 70s and had been ranching this valley since before the territory had its current name. She didn't go with him to those meetings. She understood, without being told, that those were conversations between people who had years of shared history in this place and who needed to feel out their positions without a newcomer in the room. She had other things to do, because the information coming back from town wasn't just about land sales and loans. It was about people. And people, she had learned over 30 years of managing a household and making do, were the real currency. She knew that Pete had a younger sister in Billings he sent money to every month, which explained certain economies in his personal spending. She knew that Doyle, who never talked, had nevertheless communicated through action that he was the most loyal man on this ranch and would do anything asked of him by people he respected. She knew that the Greer brothers had worked for 3 different outfits before this one and left 2 of them under difficult circumstances, which meant they understood what a good situation looked like from the outside as well as the inside. She knew that Russ, who had spent 6 weeks being her quiet adversary, had shifted into something she couldn't name yet, but which felt, cautiously, like an ally. Not a warm one, not uncomplicated, but real. She started writing things down, not in a diary. She'd never kept one, had always found the practice slightly self-conscious, but a working ledger, the kind used for household accounts, which she expanded to include notes about people in the valley that came to her through conversation. Names, circumstances, who owed what to whom and in what way, who had dealt with Crowell and who hadn't yet, who seemed afraid and who seemed angry, and which of those was more useful. She didn't know what she was building exactly. She just knew it felt like the right kind of preparation. The morning Russ came to her directly, not in passing, not with something else as cover. She knew something had changed. He found her in the kitchen before anyone else was up, which was where she was every morning, and he sat down at the table without being invited, which was how she knew it was serious. Crowell approached me, he said. She put down her spoon. When? Yesterday. I went into town for the wire and he was at the livery. He put both hands on the table. Knew my name. Knew how long I'd been with Gideon. Knew things he shouldn't have known unless someone talked to him. What did he want? Information. Dressed it up as conversation. Said he understood this was a well-run operation and that he admired the people who kept it running, that men like me were the real backbone of a ranch. He said the last part with a flatness that conveyed exactly how he'd received it. Asked if I was satisfied with my situation. Said a man with my experience had options. She looked at him carefully. What did you say? I said I was very satisfied, thank you, and I went and got my wire. He looked at his hands. But he slipped a card into my coat pocket when we shook hands. I didn't notice until I was outside. He put the card on the table. She looked at it but didn't pick it up. Cream-colored, good paper stock. Victor Crowell, Land and Resource Acquisition, Helena, Montana. He's working the men, she said. He's working everyone. That's what he does. Russ finally looked up at her with the direct attention of a man who has decided something. I should have taken this to Gideon. I came to you first. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Because you saw him, and you came back, and you knew what you'd seen. And Gideon sees the land, the legal angles, the cattle and the fences, he paused. You see people. Evelyn picked up the card, turned it over. The back was blank. He's building something, she said, not just buying land. If he was just buying land, he wouldn't need to approach the hands. He needs inside information, or he needs someone to sign something, or he needs to know when the ranch is at its most vulnerable. She set the card down. Do the other men know he approached you? Not yet. Tell them, tonight, all of them. She stood up. A man like Crowell works best when people think they're the only one being approached. When they know they're all being worked the same way, it changes things. Russ looked at her for a moment. You think like someone who's been maneuvered before. I was managed by people who thought I was too simple to notice it for 15 years, she said. I noticed every time. She went back to the stove. Tell Gideon, too. He needs to know Crowell is moving on the men, not just the land. Russ took the card off the table, stood up. Evelyn. She waited. I was wrong about you, he said. Simple. Flat. The kind of statement that doesn't come with elaboration from certain men. I know, she said. He almost smiled. He went out chiati perchikats. She told Gideon herself that evening in the 10 minutes after supper when the men had gone out and the kitchen was quiet. She told him about Russ, about the card, about her read on what Crowell was building. He listened with his forearms on the table and his coffee untouched, and she watched his expression move through several things before settling into something she recognized now as his working face, the one that meant he was past reacting and into planning. He's going to make a move on August Pearl's water rights, Gideon said. Pearl's confused about that loan. I talked to him last week. He didn't understand what he signed, and I think Crowell's depending on that. Can Pearl get out of it? Depends what he signed. I haven't seen the documents. He looked up. I need to see the documents. Can you get them? Pearl might let me look if I asked right. He was quiet for a moment. He's proud. Doesn't like to admit when he's been taken advantage of. Evelyn thought about August Pearl. She'd met him once on a supply run, a compact, weathered man with the careful dignity of someone who had lived a hard life and kept his self-respect through it. Take him something, she said. What? When you go. Take him something from the house, not as a gift, not formally, just the way neighbors do, something from the kitchen. It changes the character of the visit from you coming to see his papers to you coming to see him. Gideon looked at her with the expression she'd come to think of as his recalibration expression, the one that appeared when she said something that reorganized his picture of a situation. You know people, he said. I've had to, she said. He nodded slowly, then, come with me. She blinked. To Pearl's? He's a man who responds to, he seemed to search for the word, normalcy. A rancher coming with his wife looks different than a rancher coming alone to look at a man's private business. She thought about that. All right, she said. I'll make something tomorrow morning. He picked up his coffee finally and drank. And then, in the quiet that followed, he said, When you introduced yourself in town, Crowell, you told him you were Evelyn Vale. She met his eyes, came out that way. I'm not saying it was wrong. He set the cup down. I'm saying I noticed. The kitchen was very quiet. We should probably talk about what we are, she said, at some point. Probably, he agreed. Neither of them said anything more about it that night, but it sat between them differently than the other silences had. Not empty, not cautious, full of something that both of them were being careful with, because they had both learned the hard way that care was how you kept things intact. What? They went to Pearl's ranch the next morning. Evelyn, with a wrapped loaf of bread and a jar of last fall's apple butter she'd found in the back of the root cellar that was still good. Pearl met them on his porch with the contained surprise of a man who wasn't expecting company but wasn't going to show it. Over an hour at Pearl's kitchen table, with bread and coffee and the particular social arithmetic of three people who are circling something without going directly at it, Gideon eventually got to the loan documents. Pearl went quiet when they were on the table. Evelyn looked at them. She was not a legal expert. She would never have claimed to be. But she had kept the Hartwell household accounts for 15 years. She had read every document that came through Calvin's house, whether she was supposed to or not, and she understood, reading slowly and carefully, that what August Pearl had signed was not what August Pearl had been told he was signing. "What does it mean?" Pearl asked, watching her face. "It means," she said carefully, "that if this note is called, if the bank decides to collect, they can take your south pasture, the one with the creek." Pearl's face went very still. "Did Crowell explain that part?" she asked. "He said it was standard language." Pearl's voice was flat. "He said every loan had language like that. He said it was nothing to worry about." Evelyn looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at the documents. "August. What bank issued this?" Pearl told him. Gideon was still for a moment. "That bank is out of Billings. I know the manager. He's straight." He looked up. "But I don't know who issued this specific note or whether Crowell's got a relationship with someone inside it." He folded the documents and slid them back to Pearl. "You need to talk to the manager directly, not through Crowell, directly." "He'll think I'm a fool," Pearl said. "He'll think you're a man who reads what he signs," Evelyn said, "which is better than being a man who doesn't." Pearl looked at her for a moment with something that was part pride and part something rawer than pride. "You think Crowell lied to me?" "I think Crowell told you what you needed to hear to sign," she said, "and left out what you needed to know to understand." Pearl sat back in his chair. He looked at the documents and then at the ceiling and then at his hands. He was a proud man. She'd seen that correctly. And what she was watching was the specific dignity work of a proud man absorbing that he'd been deceived. "I need to tell McCready," he said finally. "And the Birches," Gideon said. "And Tolliver." "Tolliver's already suspicious. He told me last week something was wrong about the whole business." Pearl stood. "I should have listened." They rode back to the ranch in a silence that was not comfortable but was purposeful. The silence of two people who have done something and are processing what comes next. Halfway back, Gideon said, "He's going to move fast now. If he finds out Pearl talked to me, he'll try to call that note before we can get to the bank manager." "How long does Pearl have?" "A week, maybe. Depends on how connected Crowell is in Billings." She watched the mountains for a moment. "Then we need to move faster." "We," Gideon said. She looked at him. He wasn't challenging the word. He was tasting it. "We," she said again, clearly. He nodded and turned the horse toward home, and the word stayed in the air between them like something that had been true for a while and was only just now being said out loud. They had 5 days before Crowell made his next move. They knew this not because anyone told them, but because that was how men like Crowell operated. Give the situation just enough time to feel stable, then pull the ground out before anyone had finished finding their footing. Gideon rode to McCready's the next morning. Evelyn stayed at the ranch and did something that felt small but wasn't. She wrote letters. Not to Calvin. Not yet. She wrote to every rancher's wife in the valley, whose name she'd collected over 2 months of supply runs and careful listening. Not about Crowell, but not directly. She wrote the way women wrote to each other when something needed to be communicated without being said in a way that could be used against you later. She wrote about the apple butter she'd found in the root cellar, about Copper's leg healing, about the storm in June and the fence repair. And then, folded into the ordinary texture of those things, she asked about their spring, their cattle, their men, whether anyone had had dealings with outside business interests and how those dealings were going. It was the kind of letter that arrived looking like neighborly correspondence and left the recipient thinking very carefully about specific things. Harley watched her seal the last one and said, "You've done this before." Managed a house full of people who didn't talk to each other directly? She pressed the seal flat. For 15 years. He picked up the stack of letters. I'll take them in this afternoon. Don't leave them at the post office if Crowell's men are around. He gave her a look that suggested he was mildly offended she thought that needed saying. She raised her hands in acknowledgement, and he went out. The response came back faster than she'd expected, which told her something about how much the Valley's women already knew and had been waiting for an occasion to say. 3 letters arrived within 4 days. Margaret Birch wrote 2 pages in small, precise handwriting about a man who had come to their ranch in May, asking about the water table on their eastern section and the legal status of their creek rights, and who had left a card with a Helena address. Ellen McCready wrote 1 page saying her husband had forbidden her from discussing ranch business in correspondence, and then spent the rest of the page discussing exactly that business. A woman named Ruth Tolliver, the old rancher's daughter-in-law who managed his household since his wife passed, wrote 4 lines that contained more information than either of the other letters. My father-in-law signed something in April that he has not shown me and will not discuss. He has been sleeping poorly. The man from Helena visited 3 times. Evelyn put Ruth Tolliver's letter on top and brought the stack to Gideon that evening. He read them all without speaking. Then he went back to Ruth's and read it again. Tolliver signed something, he said, in April, before any of us knew Crowell existed. He set the letters down. Tolliver's land is the eastern gate of the valley. If he signed water rights over, or mineral rights, or access rights, Crowell doesn't need Pearl's land. He's already got what he needs to control the eastern approach. Can it be undone? Depends what he signed, same as Pearl. He looked at her. I need to go see Tolliver. I know. She picked up the letters. But Tolliver's proud in a different way than Pearl. Pearl was ashamed of being deceived. Tolliver. She thought about the 4 careful lines Ruth had written, the weight of he will not discuss and sleeping poorly. Tolliver's afraid of having made a mistake he can't fix. Those are different things. You think I can't handle him? I think you handle land and logistics, she said, without any softness intended to cushion it. I think this is a conversation about a man's dignity, and that's something else. Gideon held her gaze for a moment. She didn't look away. All right, he said. We go together. Tolliver was 73 years old and looked like the mountain itself had grown a face and learned to walk around. He met them at the door of his ranch house, a structure considerably larger and older than Gideon's, built in layers over decades, each addition visible in the change of lumber and style. And he looked at Evelyn with the frank assessment of a man who had spent a long life deciding quickly about people. You're the woman from Ohio, he said. Yes, sir. Heard you went out in the June storm to get a horse. I did. He considered this. Then he stepped back from the door. Come in, then. Ruth Tolliver was in the kitchen, a sharp-faced woman of perhaps 40 who moved with the efficiency of someone managing more than she was given credit for. She looked at Evelyn with immediate recognition, the look of a woman who has written an honest letter and has now seen the person who received it walk through her door. Evelyn gave her a small nod. Ruth gave one back and went to put on coffee. They sat in the main room, all 4 of them, and the conversation began the way those conversations always begin, around the edges of the thing, circling it, talking about the summer range and the state of the road north of Amber Ridge. Tolliver was not a man who would be pushed. Evelyn understood this immediately and sat back and let Gideon do the opening, because Gideon had known this man for years, and that counted for something, and she knew her role today was different from what it had been at Pearl's kitchen table. But it was Tolliver himself who finally brought it straight. I signed something in April I shouldn't have, he said. He said it like he was pulling something out of himself physically. Looked at the window when he said it, not at either of them. No one rushed to fill the silence. Crowell came in March, Tolliver continued, said he represented investors interested in developing a regional water management system. Said it would benefit all the ranches, show reduced flooding in spring, regulated flow in dry summer months. Said the valley was behind modern progress. He paused. I'm an old man. I know I'm an old man. There's a specific way people talk to old men when they think the old man is behind. I didn't like it, but I thought, maybe he's right. Maybe I'm not seeing something. What did you sign? Gideon asked. An agreement granting access and management rights to the Eastern Creek branch. For 20 years. He finally looked at them. He told me I'd retain ownership, that it was just a management arrangement. He had a lawyer with him who explained it in terms I understood, and I thought I understood, and I signed. Ruth set coffee cups down and sat next to her father-in-law. She'd clearly heard this story before, or part of it, and she looked at Evelyn with the expression of a woman who has been living with this weight on behalf of someone she loved. 20-year management rights on the Eastern Branch, Gideon said carefully. That branch feeds 3 ranches downstream. If he controls flow on that branch, he controls the Eastern Valley, Tolliver said. I know. I worked it out 2 weeks after I signed, when I was lying awake at 3 a.m. He set his cup down. What I don't know is whether it can be undone. Evelyn spoke for the first time since they'd sat down. Where's the document now? Tolliver looked at her. My strongbox. Can I see it? He was quiet for a moment. She didn't soften the request or explain it or apologize for it. She just waited. He got up and went to the back of the house, and Ruth looked at Evelyn and said quietly, Thank you for coming. Thank you for writing honestly, Evelyn said. Nobody else was asking. I'm asking now. The document was worse than Pearl's and better than she'd feared, which was to say, it was clearly drafted by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had done it in a way that left room for interpretation, which was both Crowell's protection and, as it turned out, his vulnerability. Evelyn read it twice. Gideon read it twice. They didn't talk while they read. Tolliver sat across from them with the stillness of a man who has decided to let other people carry something for a while because he is too tired to carry it himself. The management rights are contingent on active development, Evelyn said finally. Section 4. He has to begin development work within 18 months of signing or the agreement lapses. Gideon looked at where she was pointing. Read it. He signed in April. April of this year. So he has until October of next year to begin work. He looked up. But if we can show he misrepresented the nature of the agreement, that the lawyer's explanation contradicted the actual terms, that's fraud. That voids the contract regardless of the timeline. You'd need the lawyer, Evelyn said, someone who was there and heard what was said. Or you'd need Crowell to overreach before October, Tolliver said. They both looked at him. He was sharper than he'd seemed when they first sat down. Or not sharper, she thought, but present in a way that grief and shame had been obscuring. He's been moving fast because he thinks nobody's connected the pieces yet. He's going to move on Pearl next. When he does, he'll tip his hand. He already moved on Pearl, Gideon said. Pearl's going to the bank manager in Billings this week. Tolliver was quiet for a moment. Pearl's a stubborn old mule. He is, Gideon agreed, but he's going. A long pause. Then something happened to Tolliver's face. Not relief exactly, more like a man setting down a weight he's been convinced he has to carry alone and finding that the ground holds it just fine. What do you need from me? He asked. Calvin arrived on a Wednesday. Evelyn was in the kitchen when she heard the wagon, and she looked out the window and felt her stomach drop in the specific way it dropped only for him. Not fear exactly, not anymore. More like the body's memory of what fear used to feel like, activating out of habit. He looked smaller than she remembered. That was the first thing she noticed. Calvin had always seemed large to her, large in the way of people who take up more space than they physically occupy, because the force of their personality crowds everything else to the walls. But standing in the yard of this ranch, with the mountains behind him, and Harley watching from the barn doorway, and Gideon's property all around him, he looked like what he was, a medium-sized man from Ohio who had made a long trip and was not entirely sure of his reception. She went outside. He turned when he heard the door. He looked at her with the expression she'd seen him wear only a handful of times in her life, the expression of Calvin Hartwell when he was not sure of his ground. You look well, he said. What are you doing here, Calvin? He pulled off his hat. It was the same hat he'd worn for 10 years, brown felt, slightly misshapen on the left side. I need to talk to you. I gathered that. Why? He glanced at Harley, who hadn't moved. Can we... inside? Harley, she said, without looking away from Calvin. Can you let Gideon know we have a visitor? Already went, Harley said, which meant he'd seen the wagon coming from further off than she had. She brought Calvin into the kitchen. She did not offer him coffee immediately, which she was aware was a statement. She stood at the counter and he stood near the table, and they looked at each other across the space that had always existed between them and was not smaller for her having traveled 1,000 miles. Crowell contacted me, Calvin said. Her whole body went still. He reached out through a business acquaintance in Columbus, said he had interests in the Montana Valley where you'd been placed, said he understood my family had a connection to the Vale Ranch. Calvin turned his hat in his hands. He wanted me to come out here and help facilitate something. He said it would be financially beneficial. What kind of something? Calvin's jaw moved. He wanted you to sign a document, some kind of household or property consent. He said it was standard, that spouses sometimes needed to co-sign on land assessments. He said you'd understand what it was. I wouldn't have, she said, because it wouldn't have been what he said it was. I know that. He said it quietly. I know that now. Did you know it then? A long pause, the honest kind. I suspected, he said. I didn't let myself think too hard about it. Evelyn looked at her brother and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not the anger she'd been carrying since that morning at the breakfast table, or not only that, something underneath it. The specific exhaustion of having been treated as a means to an end by the same person for so long that the pattern had become the whole of the relationship. He found you because he needed someone who had a hold on me, she said, and he thought you still did. Calvin didn't answer. Does he still think that? I told him I'd come, Calvin said. I didn't tell him what I'd do when I got here. The door behind him opened and Gideon came in, and the kitchen recalibrated around a third presence. Gideon looked at Calvin with the flat, assessing look he wore when he was deciding something about a person. Calvin looked at Gideon with something more complicated. The look of a man encountering someone who has treated his sister better than he did, and knowing it. Gideon looked at Evelyn. She gave him the shortest possible version with her eyes. He turned back to Calvin. Tell me everything Crowell said to you, Gideon said. Word for word as best you remember. Yeah, Calvin talked for an hour. He was not, it turned out, as unreachable as Evelyn had spent years believing. He was limited. That was the more accurate word. A limited man who had done limited things, some of them cruel, not from malice, but from the particular smallness of a person who had never been asked to be larger. Sitting at Gideon's kitchen table, telling everything Crowell had said and promised and implied, he seemed to understand something about himself that he'd been avoiding, and the understanding was not comfortable, and he was not handling it gracefully, which was at least honest. What he gave them was what they needed. Crowell had been operating in 3 territories before Montana. 2 of the situations had ended in legal disputes. There was a former associate, a lawyer named Brennan, who had drafted documents for Crowell in Wyoming and who had parted ways with him badly, who, according to the business acquaintance who'd connected Calvin to Crowell, had been looking for an occasion to say what he knew. Brennan, Gideon said. You know him? Evelyn asked. No, but Tolliver might. He's got connections in Wyoming from his early years. He stood up. If Brennan will talk. He wants to talk, Calvin said. They both looked at him. He looked uncomfortable with their attention, but held it. That's what the acquaintance told me. He said Brennan had been looking for someone to take the case forward. He just needed the right situation. Evelyn looked at her brother across the table. You could have sent a letter. I know. You came because you wanted to see whether I was all right. He looked at his hat. Margaret sends her regards. Thomas? Something in Calvin's face shifted. He talks about you. Carries the letter you sent him. Shows people the part about the horse. She felt the complicated weight of that, of a child's uncomplicated love existing in a complicated house. She picked up her brother's coffee cup and refilled it without deciding to. It was a small thing. Maybe it was the only small thing she had right now. Gideon sent 2 telegrams that evening, one to Tolliver asking about Brennan, one to the bank manager in Billings, whose name Pearl had finally provided, laying out the outline of what they'd found. Tolliver's response came back the next morning. He knew Brennan, had done business with the man's former firm years ago, and would send a letter of introduction immediately. The bank manager's response took 2 days and said he was reviewing Pearl's loan documentation with concern and would be in contact with the relevant parties. Crowell made his move on Friday. A messenger arrived at the ranch, not Crowell himself, which was characteristic, with a formal document requesting that Evelyn Vale, as co-resident of the Vale property, acknowledge and consent to a land survey being conducted on the northern section, the results of which would be filed with the Territorial Land Office. The document was official-looking. The language was dense. A person reading quickly, or a person who trusted that what something appeared to be was what it was, might have signed it. Evelyn read every word. Gideon read every word. "This isn't a survey consent," she said. "No," he said. "It's a rights acknowledgement. If you sign this, you're acknowledging that the survey results, whatever he puts in them, represent an accurate account of the property boundaries and water access points." He set it down. "And his surveyor would put in whatever Crowell told him to put in. He's trying to get me to legitimize false documents. Before we can get to the bank or to Brennan." They looked at each other. "He's scared," she said. "He's moving fast because Pearl went to the bank. He knows the clock changed." Gideon folded the document. "Shutst. I'm going to write a response declining and noting that any survey of this property requires the owner's consent, not the co-residents." "Sign it from both of us," she said. He looked at her. "We said we," she said. "Start acting like it." He signed it from both of them. Bomb. What happened over the following 3 weeks was not dramatic in the way stories sometimes make things dramatic. It was paperwork and telegrams and 2 rides to Billings, one of which Evelyn made with Gideon, and one of which she made alone because Gideon needed to be at the ranch, while Harley was down with a bad back and the cattle needed management. She met Brennan in the bank manager's office. A thin, precise man with the particular energy of someone who has been waiting a long time to say something. He had documents going back 4 years. He had signed statements from 2 ranchers in Wyoming. He had a specific recollection of conversations in which Crowell had outlined plainly his method of operation: find isolated properties, target owners without legal sophistication, use loan structures and survey manipulations to acquire controlling interests in water rights, then leverage those rights against every downstream user in the region. Evelyn sat in that office and listened and took notes in the small ledger she'd started carrying, and at the end of it she said to Brennan, "Will you come to Amber Ridge and say this to the people it happened to?" He said yes. She hadn't been sure he would. He came the following week. Gideon gathered the ranchers, Pearl, Tolliver, the Birches, McCready, 3 others she'd only met by name through letters, at the Amber Ridge Hotel meeting room, which was small and smelled like old wood and lamp oil, and Brennan said what he'd said to Evelyn and showed what he had to show. Crowell was not in Amber Ridge by then. He'd left 4 days after the declined survey document, and nobody had seen him since, which Evelyn thought was the clearest possible confirmation that he'd known the walls were closing. The legal process that followed was slow and imperfect and required more patience than any of them particularly had. Pearl's loan terms were renegotiated through the bank manager, who turned out to be a decent man who was furious about what had been done using his institution's name. Tolliver's agreement was challenged on the misrepresentation grounds, and the case went to the territorial court in Helena, and it took 4 months and cost Tolliver money he didn't enjoy spending, but the agreement was voided in November. Crowell was never criminally charged. That was the part that sat in Evelyn's stomach for a long time. The part where a man who had done genuine damage to real people simply moved his operation somewhere else and continued. There was no clean resolution for that. She knew it, and she sat with it, and she didn't dress it up as something it wasn't. But the valley held. The water stayed where it was supposed to stay. The ranchers who had been isolated from each other by pride and distance and the particular loneliness of hard country learned, slowly, that the woman on the Vale Ranch sent honest letters and meant what she wrote, and that was worth something. But Calvin stayed for 2 weeks. He helped with the fence that needed repair on the south section, which nobody asked him to do, and which he did badly at first and better by the end. He ate at the table with the men and didn't try to be more than he was, which was the best thing he could have done. On his last evening, he sat with Evelyn on the porch after supper. in the cold that had started arriving in the evenings now that September was moving toward October. And he said things that were not adequate for what 15 years required, but were more than she'd expected from him. He said he'd told Thomas he was coming to see her. He said Thomas had asked him to tell her that Copper sounded like a very good horse. She laughed. Genuinely. It surprised her. "I wasn't good to you," Calvin said. "No. I don't have a reason that's good enough." "I know. Margaret thinks—" He stopped. "Margaret's a harder person than I want to be." He looked out at the dark mountains. "I let her lead in that direction more than I should have." "You're a grown man, Calvin. You let yourself." He absorbed that. "Fair," he said. She looked at him. Her brother, who had handed her off like a problem and accidentally delivered her somewhere she fit. She wasn't going to tell him that. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of it having worked out, as if intention and outcome were the same thing. They weren't. What he'd done was still what he'd done. But she was also not going to carry him as a wound for the rest of her life, because she was tired of carrying things that belonged to other people. "Write to Thomas," she said. "Teach him not to be like you were." He nodded. He looked like he was going to say something else and then didn't. Sometimes that was enough. He left the next morning. Gideon asked her on an evening in late October, the kind of evening where the cold outside made the lamplight inside feel like something deliberate. They were at the table after supper. The men had gone out. The kitchen had the quiet of a place that had become familiar enough to rest in. He didn't make a ceremony of it. That was not who he was. He set his coffee down and looked at her and said, "I'd like to marry you, if you're willing." She looked at him across the table, this man who had seen her straight from the first day, who had moved out of her way so she could go into a storm after a horse, who had signed documents with her name next to his like it was the obvious thing, who had said "we" back to her when she said it first and had meant it every time since. "I'm willing," she said. He nodded. The corner of his mouth moved. "Was there going to be more to the question?" she asked. "Was there supposed to be?" Most people include the reasons. He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything. "I think you already know the reasons," he said, "and I think saying them out loud would embarrass both of us." She considered this. "Fair point," she said. They sat with it for a moment. Outside, the mountains were doing what they always did, holding the valley, indifferent and enormous and absolutely unimpressed with the small human proceedings occurring inside this particular house. But the lamp was burning, and the coffee was warm, and somewhere in the barn Copper was settled in his stall with his leg healed and his trust intact. She had left Ohio with a suitcase tied with rope and the conviction, built over 15 years of being treated as a burden, that she was someone the world would always look past. She had been wrong about that. Not in the easy way of a person who gets rescued and learns their value through being chosen. It was more complicated than that, and more real. She had been wrong because the conviction itself was a lie she'd been handed by people too small to see her, and she'd carried it because she hadn't yet had the occasion to test it against anything else. The occasion had come. She'd tested it. She knew now what she was made of. Not because someone told her, but because she'd gone out in a hailstorm for a horse, and read documents in a stranger's kitchen, and written letters to women she'd never met, and stood in front of her brother without flinching, and helped hold a valley together by doing the things she had always done, paying attention, remembering